training series. My name is Justin Ford, and I will be introducing today's session. Please note that this session will be offered in English for the first 30 minutes. The French session will immediately follow at 2 p.m. Veuillez noter que cette session sera offerte en anglais pour les premières 30 minutes et que la présentation en français suivra à 14 heures. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I encourage all of you to acknowledge the land you're on as well. As we move through today's session, please share your comments in the chat space. Questions by using the Q&A button in the language of your choice. You could vote for the questions you like by clicking on the thumbs up button. Please note that there will be no Q&A portion to the session. However, we will take your questions, find the answers, and share them as a resource on our Federal Youth Network GC Wiki page. As somebody who's been in the public service for about 5 years now, I can easily remember a time when early in my career, I would be hearing terms such as ATIP, Section 34, or labor relations thrown around in meetings. An immediate feeling of confusion would ensue. Some of these terms I was explained rather quickly because they directly impacted my daily work, while some others took months or some of them even years to fully understand. We probably all know that the public service loves their many, many acronyms. Today, we will learn about perhaps one of the most famous ones, the ATIP. What does it mean? Why is it important? And most importantly, how does it impact me? Before we get started, we have a couple of poll questions to assess your knowledge before the session. Don't worry if you don't know the answers. It's all for fun. Can we put up the polls now? Do you know which act dictates who can spend money? Well, take a time to answer that one. It's a simple yes or no question. I see some answers rolling in now. But with that, let's see. Here comes the answers. So we have, do you know which act dictates who can spend money? 17% of you said yes. 83% of you said no. Interesting. I don't know if I do either. Well, without further ado, I will hand off the mic, figuratively speaking, to Reda Bourgeois, who will be our moderator for today. Reda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I think you meant a series on finance and not ATIP, but that's not a problem. The session for ATIP was last week, and it was a really, really great event. And if you're interested in seeing that recording, it is available on the Federal Youth Network website. But good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all doing very well today on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon, or maybe morning for some of us. To get this event started in the right way, I would like to first acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. And I would also like to recognize that many of you who are attending today's event are participating from other traditional territories all over the country. To quickly introduce myself, my name is Reda Bourgeois, and I'm currently working as a policy analyst with the Policy and Partnerships branch over at Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. And I'm also leading the role of the Vice President of Learning with the CERNAC and ISC Young Professionals Network. And today I have the pleasure of moderating this event in English and in French. So as you know, the public service is the largest employer in Canada, and new employees in particular have a lot to discover and learn, from key rules to common acronyms. This GC101 series is really designed to look at several functional areas, including finance, which we'll be looking at today, to give you essentially all the basics that you need to be informed and be successful in your day-to-day job. And today we have the pleasure of discussing finance with our very special guest, Kevin Arsenault, who is currently the Director of Security Operations at Correctional Services Canada. Once again, thank you so much, Kevin, for accepting our invitation. So today, one of the great. So today, one of the things that we're going to learn is 5 key finance terms. And the goal behind this session, like I mentioned earlier, is for you to gain some knowledge about the basic laws, regulations, policies, and also guidelines regarding finance. And don't worry, we'll make it very fun, entertaining, and also very interactive. No pressure, Kevin. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Kevin now to begin our discussion today. So Kevin, first question for you. So for someone who's just starting out in government or who doesn't necessarily have a strong foundation or background in finance, could you please start us off with some context information on the Financial Administration Act, or also known as the FAA, and who it applies to?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. I think it's a good starting point for today's discussion. As you mentioned, the Financial Administration Act is really what governs how government can spend money. And there's 3 sections that you most typically hear referenced in common language in boardrooms. And those are section 32, 33, 34. Really what that means is when we reference a section, it's one paragraph within that act. So section 32, meaning it's the 32nd paragraph within that act. And it's labeled as such. If you look at the FAA, if you can look it up online, the Financial Administration Act, it's divided by these sections. Really what section 32 really means, if you heard that term before, it's given to a specific, if you will, it's a specific position within an organization. There's different positions that have section 32, but it allows that person to essentially commit to spending some funds. So if you're dealing with a program, for example, oftentimes it's at the manager level that you would see that someone would have section 32, meaning that they can enter into a contract or PO or different terms we hear to spend funds. We're committing funds. We're going to undertake a project and spend funds with a supplier. So that's section 32. Section 34, and I'm skipping 33 for a reason, because this the order of how things kind of usually take place. Section 32 happens first, and then when we get an invoice for goods and services that are delivered, that's where section 34 comes into play. So section 34 essentially is given to a person that can validate that the invoice that we're receiving was in fact pre-approved. So again, section 32, and that what's being charged is essentially what we've received as far as a goods and service. It is compliant with the PO or the contract we have in place. So we're validating that everything is in good order, and then section 34 takes place. Section 33 is kind of what you see in the back end. That's really the power to pay the invoice. So that's essentially typically done by a financial officer, so FIs, their collective agreement. That's where section 33 typically takes place. And what they do, they validate that the person who signed section 34 that validated the invoice has the proper delegated authority. So I said a couple of words there that might be new ones as well. So maybe I'll take a second to explain how things typically work in a department. So what happens is the department at the very head, department head is given authority to essentially spend funds, get into contracts, and that authority is delegated downwards through an organization through what we call essentially delegation instruments. Every department has their own structure, but what really happens is kind of as you go down the hierarchy of a department, the authority gets delegated up into, so usually it's about a manager level where you would kind of stop that. And the manager essentially would be like the lowest level. So typically as you move up on the hierarchy, you get more delegated authority. So for example, usually those are financial limits. You get into essentially higher limits, for lack of a better term. I'm simplifying things a little bit, but that's kind of how, if you will, finance authorities are delegated in government. So I'm not sure that kind of provides a quick overview. That provides secondary questions, but that's the 30,000 in the year view of kind of how governments spend money.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And you kind of answered a part of my second question, which was referring to these different sections, Section 32, Section 33, and Section 34. And I'm sure that many of us are now much more comfortable with these terms, and will certainly, in the near future, at least I hope for all of us, will be able to use them in our leadership positions. In the same context, it would be great if you could also clarify a few points for us, such as what do they do in order to get signing authority, or who delegates that authority, as well as who can sign in place of another person?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. So I guess the first part of that answer, I will say that authority is delegated to a position, not to a person in a delegation instrument. What I mean by that is, for example, I have Section 34 or 32 approval, but if I change positions, that might not be the case, right? So it doesn't follow a person throughout different positions. It essentially is delegated for a person in a specific position. And if those circumstances change, then the delegation might not necessarily apply. So what happens in this case, if your supervisor has delegated authority and you're in a position that within the org structure, within the delegation instrument that you can have authority, you'll have to sign what's called a specimen signature card, which will say this person in this role can sign for these specific budgets. So essentially it limits what you're allowed to sign for. And typically there's training that's involved to be able to sign something. So back in the day, it was called the G110. It may have changed now, but it was training. It's training that you have to do through the Canada School of Public Service. Quite a lengthy training to be able to actually have the authority. So oftentimes, what you'll see is new managers in new management positions will have to do training before they can actually sign off on an invoice or, for example, approve a PO. So that's typically how things work. There's a level of training. And as I mentioned, it's important to remember that even if you're in a position where you're given authority, if you change positions, that you would have to sign a new specimen signature card. So you would have to, your new essentially boss would have to delegate the authority down to you in this new position, because it doesn't follow the position. It doesn't follow the person. It follows a position, if you will. And then you also mentioned acting. So that's another good question. What typically you would see in a person's specimen signature card is you would have a list of what we call acting appointees. So it would say, during my absence, there's these people that are listed that can be asked to act in my absence. And when that would take place, there would essentially be what's called an acting memo that would be sent saying that this specific person that's on the signature card will be acting for a very fixed period of time. You had to define a period, and during that period of absence, the person who was acting in the position would then therefore have the same authority as the incumbent. So then they would be able to essentially approve POs within their financial limit, approve Section 34, so invoices, for example. So that's essentially how the signing authority is managed in most departments.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I see that time is flying very quickly. So I'm going to turn to my second last point, which is to understand a little bit better the nature, perhaps even the meaning of budget fund reporting, which is a term that we sometimes hear in our workplaces. So I'm not sure if you'd be able to maybe elaborate a little bit more on that specific term.
On budget, you said?
On the budget fund reporting.
Okay, budget fund reporting specifically. I'm not overly familiar with that term, but I can speak a little bit about budgeting for sure, and forecasting, because I think it's important for people to understand that as well in the finance realm, even if you're not in the finance role. So what happens at the beginning of each fiscal year, which I think everyone would know, the fiscal year starts April 1st, runs until March 31st of the following calendar year. That 12-month period essentially is the fiscal year, where governments are provided a budget from Parliament. And then from there, Essentially, the budget of the department gets, if you will, distributed at different levels, whether it's a sector or a division. I'm not sure every department has their own wording for how it's divided, but essentially it gets subdivided into smaller sections, and that really is kind of the first step into the budget exercise. So at the beginning of the year, essentially each subdivision would have to, with what's allocated, determine what they're going to do, how they're going to spend their money, and then throughout the year. So there's what we call financial reviews, or cash forecasts, for example. There's different words, but they all mean the same thing in different departments. Each section, each smaller section of a department would provide a snapshot of where they are today, what they spent so far, and what they plan to spend between the current period and the end of the fiscal year, and really to determine if the department will, in a situation that they're going to be overspending, which they can't do, or underspending. And the reason why that's important to do that throughout the year is because if, for example, if your specific area was given a budget of $1 million, and you get to the end of the, let's say, P6, so it's mid-year, you get to, let's say, the end of September, and you're not going to spend that $1 million, you're looking at maybe more, but $500,000. That means that there's $500,000 there that the department can reallocate to another part of the department. And the reason it's important to do that throughout the year is because any amount that is essentially given to the department has to be spent before the end of the fiscal year. So it has to be spent essentially before March 31st of the next calendar year. And the later in time of that year that budget allocations get done, so that you take money from one budget to give it to another part of the organization, the less time it gives to that section or that unit to enter into contracts, but that can take some time, and deliver results, right? Because the other thing that's important to take note is, in order for this funds to be allocated in a fiscal year, to be spent in a fiscal year, the goods and services have to be delivered. What I mean by that is, if you're responsible for, let's say, a program and you have a contract in place, the contract, let's say you sign it in December, but the goods are only delivered in April or May of the next year, then you haven't spent that money. The goods and services have to be delivered before March 31st, so that it can be essentially belonging to the current fiscal year. So that's really important, that takes place. So that's really why the budgeting and forecasting exercise in a department is extremely important. And even if you're not in a financial role, you might be asked questions from, let's say, your manager or other people in your team on, what are we planning to do in the next 6 months? What are we planning to do in the next 4 months? And it's really to get a better understanding around, where we'll land at the end of the year from a budget standpoint. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question, but as you can see, the budgeting and forecasting throughout the year is instrumental to make sure that the department doesn't overspend, but also that if there's opportunities to essentially relocate funds to another area of the organization, that can be done in a timely fashion.
It does. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that great answer. And I was looking at the same time at the Q&A chat, and I saw a few questions there that piqued my interest. At the same time, one of the attendee asked if there were any GCpedia or other resources that these general sections, like for instance, section 32 or section 34 rules, to refer back to. Like, are there any other resources that are available out there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that probably the best one is the Canada School of Public Service. So I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with that department, or will soon be if you have to do mandatory training. So in the Canada School of Public Service, there's a lot of information there as far as functional authorities, functional areas like finance being one of them. So you don't necessarily have to be in a FI, again, classification, but a financial role to do those courses. You can have a good overview of, for example, of the section 32, section 33, 34. The other thing too, if again, it would be dependent on your manager and support, but I have seen some people do delegation training, authority delegation training for development purposes. So even though you're not planning to be in a role where you'll have a budget and be delegated that authority, since the people, do the full training, given support by their management in order to develop and better understand essentially how that all comes together. So the Canada School, I think, has a great library of, oftentimes online learning that can take place. That's probably your best bet, because again, you can look at the FAA, you can look at the actual Financial Administration Act, and I definitely encourage you to do so. But the language there is very, it's legal terminology, it's very legal jargon. So it's hard sometimes to take that and apply it into a real life environment. So that's why I think the Canada School has a good approach at really making it applying it into every lens. They often have scenarios that can kind of help you through a case, and so the training is really well made in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I'll continue on the route. So before we wrap our session, I'd like to turn again to the audience to see if we have any questions for Q&A. So I see there are several questions in the Q&A chat. Perhaps I'll start with the first one that I see on the screen here. One of our attendees asked, okay, so I'll quote here. So I heard that our fiscal year begins April 1st, but I've also heard some directorates still haven't gotten their budget approved yet. Is there a time limit for budgets to get approved? And what happens if there is a lengthy delay?
Yeah, that's probably more speaking to something internal to how the department allocates their budget within their department. But what typically happens, essentially, usually in February, each kind of unit, as I mentioned, each subject kind of department would send out essentially what they see as their requirements for the new year that would start April 1st, and then corporate finance and department would look at that, see how it all makes sense, and then try to allocate within their envelope, their budgetary envelope. But I think the question here is maybe more departmental specific, in the case that this department might have like an internal process where they don't want to allocate funds to a certain project if they don't know if they have enough money. Maybe it's a specific initiative. But I will say that the department has to have, if you will, finances delegated to the department, because they have costs like salaries, which essentially take place, at the beginning of the year and throughout the whole year. So salary costs is something that's part of the departmental financial budget and the salary envelope. So the department can't, if you will, postpone till September to give, for example, a budget to shelf, because they're incurring salary costs throughout the year. So I think the question here is maybe more, very, again, departmental specific in this case, where it could be linked to, for example, a internal mechanism that they're trying to to get a better grasp of the situation with not allocating to specific initiatives, for example. So that could be the case. But the risk in this case is that the longer, again, that you go without having a clear understanding of what your budget is as a manager, the more chances are that you won't have sufficient time to enter into contracts, again, to spend those funds. So it's not a really, it's not a great approach to wait too long and to confirm with managers what their budgets are at the beginning of the year.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great response, Kevin. And maybe one last question, just to go back to section 32, 33, and 34. I have a question here in French, but thankfully I was able to translate it very quickly. I think it's a really good question. And that person asked that it is to his or her understanding that the same person cannot perform section 34 and section 33 for the same transaction. However, is it possible for the same person to perform section 32 and section 34?
Yeah, good question, and absolutely agree with the person's understanding that is true. So as a manager that's authorizing section 32, so again, 32 is committing funds, right? So for example, approving a PO, entering into a contract, you're committing that you will be spending these funds. Someone who has section 32 can also exercise section 34. So what that means is as a manager, I could approve a PO. When the invoice comes in, I can approve the attestation on the PO, on the invoice, saying that the goods and services were delivered according to the contract under the PO, and I am sending the payment package of the invoice with the PO or the contract over to finance for Section 33. And then another person, Section 33, would validate that I have the proper authority to do those actions, and that the funds can be released. But it is absolutely correct that someone who has Section 33 cannot exercise Section 33 and 34 for the same transaction. That is absolutely true. What will typically happen, I know it's not part of the question, but I'll maybe take a second to explain it though. Some people also have a misconception that if I am the one who approves Section 32, I must also approve Section 34, which is not necessarily the case. So what could happen, for example, again, I kind of explain the delegation to instrument. It really works typically like if you look at a pyramid. So if you look at a org chart, the deputy minister delegates it throughout the organization. Depending on the level of authority that's required for a transaction, you could have, for example, a director general approve Section 32. So they're authorizing the expense, but the actual invoice when it comes in can be approved, for example, by a manager in this case. So it's not the same level. Typically, what you'll see is that if it's a different person, Section 34 will be exercised by someone who's at a lower position. Typically, is how that would materialize. For example, travel, is typically at a higher level for approval. So if someone's approving overnight travel, it would typically be at a higher level than a manager. So that person would authorize travel, but when the travel claim comes in, it can be done at the manager level that has Section 34 for that. So not part of the question, but I thought it was maybe kind of relevant to the discussion.
Very good. Thank you so much, Kevin. And I see that we only have 3 minutes left. So thank you so much again for all of these great responses. I'll say it again. You are truly a wealth of knowledge, and I personally learned a lot in this session, and I'm sure that a lot of us have learned a lot, and it definitely enriched the knowledge of many of us. So again, thank you so much. And I did see a question during the session asking if this will be recorded. So yes, this session is being recorded as we speak and will be available on the website, the Federal Youth Network website after this event, and also on LinkedIn and other socials. And on that note, if you're interested in learning more about this topic or other related topics, please feel free to check out the resources page of the Federal Youth Network Wiki to get hyperlinks to policies and also to learn more about upcoming learning opportunities. With that, I thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to everyone who attended for this first session in English. There will be a session in French in 2 minutes, but for now, I'll hand it back over to Justin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neda, and thank you very much, Kevin. I will be honest, 5 years in government, and I learned a lot right now. I've always wondered about Section 34. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's tuning in today with us. As a reminder, the session will be repeated in French in about 1 minute's time. Comme rappel, la session en français débutera.